All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Kathryn Brownell, who is an associate professor of history at Purdue University. Her research focuses on the relationships between media, politics, and popular culture, with an emphasis on the American presidency. Additionally, she recently published her second book, 24/7 Politics, Cable Television, and the Fragmenting of America from Watergate to Fox News. So, Dr. Brownell, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, just to begin, when did you first get interested in American political history?
Oh, that's a great question. It was in undergrad. I went to the University of Michigan and I took a history class with Matt Lasseter, who is a really internationally known political historian. And the introductory class, he showed a clip of all the different ways people have reimagined the American dream. And he showed Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock playing the Star Spangled Banner. And I thought, wow, that's a fascinating way to think about American politics. And after that, I was hooked.
So, okay, so like I guess in the classroom is when you first really started to think, okay, maybe this is something I like.
Yeah, absolutely. It really started as a student because all of a sudden, what I learned in that class is that thinking historically about everything that was happening around, all of a sudden it opened up new understanding, new questions about what was happening. And it really made me see the power of history to understanding the present and rethinking some assumptions that I had grown up with.
Yeah. So, I think it's interesting that, so a lot of your work has also dealt with kind of thinking about American presidents. Obviously, there's been, a fair amount of American presidents and, yeah, the almost 250 years of the country's history. But it seems like as of late, there's been some fairly controversial ones. So, how long has the United States kind of dealt with controversial leaders of the country?
It's dealt with controversial leaders for a long, long time. And I think it's just, the controversy changes, the conversations change. The American presidency is an institution that is constantly evolving. And I think especially over the past 150 years, it's become more central to how we think about American politics more broadly. Executive power has expanded dramatically. The presence, media, right? The presence of the presidency has dramatically expanded. And so it's more, people feel a closer connection, good or bad, whether, they really like the president or they have really strong feelings against the president. The presidency has become more personalized because of the shifting relationship with the media itself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess, especially in the modern era, with I think presidents are probably more under a microscope than they've ever been before. And, there's constant reporting of presidents, and there's like obviously 24-hour news now on several different organizations, companies producing news 24/7. I guess that plays a major role. I mean, so like when controversies got out, going back in the 1800s or something, I guess it was much harder to report on or even find out about things that were going on unless someone leaked it to the press or something.
hmm Yeah, the media environment really is important to understanding here because how people would have experienced something in the 19th century, for example, that they would have read about it in their newspaper. And newspapers were overwhelmingly they were partisan, and so they would have gotten a partisan angle on what was happening. The telegraph was actually something that really was really significant in terms of changing the reporting because all of a sudden things could be reported instantly across the country. And so you have this instant transformation of information that comes with new technology. So you've got the telegraph and then radio, TV, all of these things enhance the speed which people can find out information. And then there's more people that are providing that information as well.
So, what have been kind of the common themes in American history then for presidents that have found themselves under controversy? What are the things that American presidents have historically done that have made them, not so popular in some ways?
Well, one of the presidents that I have spent a lot of time studying is Richard Nixon. So
Okay.
this is his entire being is kind of navigating controversy and, being under scrutiny, trying to shift the narratives, trying to delegitimize those people who were questioning him, trying to hold him accountable. And so, for Nixon, he really was obsessed with controlling the media narrative around his presidency. And it really begins in like throughout his entire career. He's obsessed with this. But it's really intensified in the aftermath of the 1960 election, where he firmly believes that he lost that election because of poor performance in the television debates and just an ineffective media operation that was it was not as good as John F. Kennedy's. And so this obsession with trying to control the media narrative becomes so central to how Nixon really combats any crisis. He, reinvents himself in 1968 through a very media savvy operation. And when he sees that the difference in his mind between Nixon the loser in 1960 and Nixon the winner in 1968 is a very sophisticated media operation, he assumes that that will help him get out of anything. And so when the Watergate scandal starts to unfold, he time and time again, it's like, we just need the right PR spin. He's not worried about the crimes, the break-in, all of these other things. He's worried about how to control that media narrative.
Yeah, I think Nixon is kind of seems like a very interesting point in American political history, given how hostile he was to the media and like trying to go after journalists a little bit. Was there anyone before Nixon that had kind of done that to a certain extent?
Well, Nixon took it to a whole new level.
Yeah.
And so the intensity which he kind of pursued this, this campaign, if you will. And it was a very detailed campaign against the press. It was more intense. It was more multifaceted than many other presidents. However, I would say that presidents before him, of course, have had, a contentious relationship with the press at certain times. Franklin Roosevelt, really battled against many newspaper editors during the 1930s into the war because they were really against his New Deal, and they criticized him frequently. And in fact, because of that constant criticism that he got from newspaper editors, that's one of the reasons that he used radio and motion pictures so that he could control the narrative and present the New Deal and sell his New Deal directly to the people. And he didn't have to rely on newspaper getting filtered through newspaper editors. So it gave him more control over his message. And so, again, there's a long history of presidents having, these combative at times relationships with journalists. But what I've found really interesting with Nixon, again, is just how thorough the campaign was to discredit journalists, not just print journalists, but overwhelmingly also on television. He focused a lot on TV and the TV news that he thought was constantly biased and out to get him. And one of the fascinating things that I found in my new book on cable TV is that the reason he embraced cable TV is he thought that it would undermine the television networks and their power by really hitting them at the pocketbook and challenging their monopoly that they had. And so he was thinking through policy as a way to kind of pursue this what he called it the network news problem. And so, again, which is overwhelmingly what he saw as biased coverage of his administration.
So how does like the 60s kind of media apparatus compare to today? Right now it seems like there's pretty cleanly broken between like left and right. And though there's some news organizations that kind of float around the center, like a lot of people could group media now. They have like media bias charts and stuff out. What was the 60s though like at all?
Yeah, the 1960s was such a different media environment. I talk about this with my students all the time. I'm like, who knows what rabbit ears are on top of a TV, and none of them know. And so, so it's important to remember that the television environment in the 1960s is really dominated by the big three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. And the FCC allowed them to have this monopoly. They ensured that they could, really dominate what Americans saw on their TV each day because television programming was transferred via the air. It relied on the spectrum. So not you could only have a portion of the spectrum. So because of the technology, it was very limited how many channels you could actually receive. And that's why cable was something new, because the wired technology could give you 13 channels rather than two or three. And that was really exciting at that time. And so I think, kind of understanding the technological limits of television and the regulations that upheld that is really important. Because you have these big three, they had to fulfill their public interest responsibility, right? They could dominate the airwaves, but they had to serve the public interest. And so the news programs really became the way that they defined how they were serving the public, the broader public. And so their news programs, however, were really short. Once you kind of take into account commercials, it's about 22 minutes, give or take 1 minute. And so it's really short in terms of what they're presenting. So it's very limited. It's very reliant on establishment voices and perspectives, very reflective of elite white men in New York City, like in New York City rooms, as they're kind of coming up with programming ideas, as they're thinking through what are the pressing issues of the day. So it is more, compared to our current environment that has more partisanship infused in the news. They tried to be accurate. They tried to be objective, even though they understood that objectivity was a really fraught concept. But it was very exclusionary. A lot of voices were left out. Women were left out. Black Americans were left out. Conservatives were left out. And so across the political spectrum, people were pushing for it to change.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting then to, to kind of think about Nixon and the era he was in. And, when we think about like presidents that when we're like making rankings that historians sometimes do of like presidents that were how bad they were compared to each other, I think there's a few different ways you can kind of group that because you could group it based off decisions they made, which, led to wars or major economic downturns. Um, but to a certain extent, a lot of those mistakes can also be kind of justified as like just someone who didn't know what they were doing. But ignorance is a little bit different than purposely going after kind of democratic norms, like targeting journalists. So how do you kind of like weigh in the Nixon compared to other presidents of the past when trying to analyze like, okay, who really are the presidents that are kind of like dark pages of American history versus ones that maybe just didn't know what they were doing or naive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Nixon is, again, a fascinating person to study because he was very, very smart, very, very purposeful, and he thought through a lot of things, and he wrote everything down and recorded things. So the evidence is there too, and I think that's something that presidents after him learned, that they didn't write some of these things down. They had more conversations, right? And so it becomes harder to kind of document some of these behaviors. And so I think that's one of the things that is challenging in terms of how to study presidents post Nixon because of Watergate and because it came down to, written records and of course the tapes. So I think, that's one challenge. So I am one of the historians that contributes to the C-SPAN presidential rankings
Oh, okay.
project that they do at the end of every term. And I anticipate that I will do it again after Biden's presidency. And it's really challenging because, there are these different categories, but they're very vague in terms of economic leadership, moral leadership, right? Communication abilities. And sometimes you could be really good at one of those and really bad at another one. And so it's a challenge. And it's actually, and how you define that, pursued equal justice for all. Well, what do you do with someone like Lyndon Johnson, who certainly would get, a good ranking for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but also, pursues this war in Vietnam, right? So how do you kind of justify those? Those are things that I kind of grapple with when I'm going through it. And what I've realized is that it's a really good teaching resource. I teach the American presidency, and at the end, I make my students kind of go through here, and it really it creates a very lively debate because these are not these are moving and these are malleable terms and interpretations. And so it really kind of just shows the historical profession, right? That there are there's not just one way of thinking about any one president or any one moment of history as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I guess also like having a good grasp of the historical context of each president and their situation is very useful to kind of making such a ranking because if you're not paying attention to that context, then obviously every year into the future, the presidents in the past look worse and worse if you're comparing them based off the modern day. Though I guess you could make some argument these days that maybe the modern day isn't so great. But yeah, that is interesting. So how do you think then? Like you mentioned a little bit about this, but how have current presidents, or I guess presidents after Nixon, how have they been influenced by him and beyond just don't record conversations, try to don't take so many notes. Do you think that people have kind of looked at his strategy in some ways of like trying to control the media and study that and be like, okay, this is where he was wrong, this is a way I should have done it to kind of change media narratives?
Yes, I think that he is very influential in how presidents that followed and people who wanted to be president, how they thought about campaigns, how they thought about media operations. One of the really fascinating things is that in my first book looked at the rise of the celebrity presidency and the relationship between Hollywood and presidential administrations. And I went into that book thinking that this was a story that started with Ronald Reagan, of course, an actor that, turned governor, turned president. But in fact, Ronald Reagan he's at the tail end of the book. In fact, he's more influential as governor in kind of this development of the celebrity presidency. But Nixon is actually, I end the book, the final chapter is about Nixon and his celebrity operations. Because again, this obsession with controlling this media narrative, he kind of saw the power of celebrity and really ingrained that in presidential operations, not just campaigns, but then how he, sold different policies. He was constantly looking to Hollywood for different surrogates to help sell some of his policy initiatives as well. And so he really ingrains in party operations and presidential operations the importance of putting that media, entertainment, what I call showbiz politics, as really central to its operations. And I think everyone that follows him has had to grapple with that and to think about how can I control the media narrative. And this is one of the really fascinating things that comes out, especially under Ford and Carter, is that they both are aware that they want to create a really effective and compelling media narrative, that is central to how they can govern effectively, how they can win elections. But they don't want to come off as Nixonian, right? Like this fear, like that's a term that kind of emerges, that like we don't want to look Nixonian, like we're doing it to manipulate things. But of course it is manipulation. But they want to show that it's not a dark manipulation, that they're trying to, bring more of themselves to the American people. But of course, it's very, very artfully crafted.
Yeah, so how we developed this kind of obsession with particular people when they're running for office and have turned them into celebrities, or maybe they were a celebrity beforehand a little bit. Um, that's kind of an interesting thing. Has this always been kind of an aspect of American culture since the development of Hollywood, though? I mean, it seems like there's always been this obsession with fame, at least the last several decades. And it's kind of like, we don't have a royal family, but we try to create one all the time, it seems
Mm-hmm.
like.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed this is like a trend for a long time in the US?
Yeah, it's absolutely a trend, but it's one that has not been natural, and it has not gone uncontested. And so I think that there's a tendency, there's this great quote by Jack Valenti, who was the head of the Motion Picture Association in the 1990s. And he was looking at the Clinton presidency, and kind of this close collaboration between Bill Clinton and Hollywood. And he says something along the lines of that, movie stars and politicians, they share the same DNA, right? Like they're naturally like one another and they gravitate towards one another. But in fact, that is not true. If you look historically at this relationship, Hollywood has been around really since the 1920s. And it was There are a lot of censorship campaigns going around productions in the 1920s and 1930s, frequently at the local and state level, but they were always worried about national politics. It's also an industry that was run by Jewish immigrants that were battling really strident anti-Semitism at the time and really searching to show that they belonged in American politics and culture. And so it was really controversial, this link between Hollywood and politics. It was an incredibly controversial development, which is why you have things like the House Un-American Activities investigation that if you read through, they're looking at this obsession with communism in Hollywood. It's because they're very worried that entertainers are going to manipulate people's minds, and that they don't have the political chops, and so that the entertainers can be manipulated by the communists, right? And so there's this deep fear of what happens when our politics become more media driven, what happens when entertainment becomes a factor, and tremendous pushback against this. And so it's this really controversial development, this embrace of again, what I call showbiz politics, which is, I define it as politicians cultivating a relationship with Hollywood and cultivating their own celebrity status as a path to political power. When John F. Kennedy did it in 1960, people like Eleanor Roosevelt called him out for relying too much on media and money. And so again, it ultimately takes root because someone like Richard Nixon, is like obsessed with this and decides, okay, we're going to ingrain it. I'm going to think about ways to professionalize these operations. But it really took 3 to 4 decades for this to become a part of American political culture.
So then I guess thinking about like the modern media today then and the rise of social media and the internet, I mean, it sounds like we've kind of reached an era then where all these things of like Hollywood and media outlets and their influence on politics has kind of reached an even greater scale than we could have ever imagined, considering now like campaigns are run on social media all the time and everything's in the news. It just seems like we're just building up into kind of this crazier and crazier situation then.
Well, I think one of the things that happens first with cable television in the 1980s and 1990s, and then with the internet and social media, is that you have the democratization in many ways of celebrity. More people can have access to these audiences and to building up their public profile, and to have that search, right? Their 15 minutes of fame. And so you have more people that can have a say in these different media apparatuses. It's not as expensive to kind of get in there, right? Anyone can have a Twitter account and try to create themselves as a particular influencer these days. Where that's different from the days of Hollywood, where breaking into the studio system was very, very difficult. They had this entire team of publicists that were working to turn certain people, like Clark Gable, or Betty Davis, into a star, right? It was very difficult to gain star status in the 1950s, even by the 1950s and 1960s. So I think the media environment changes this. It decentralizes some of these operations, but it then makes it all about, how do you attract attention? How do you attract ratings? And I think one of the challenges that you see in social media today is that cultivating and stirring outrage becomes a way to get that fame, if you will. You thinking more about notoriety and clicks. Well, what's going to generate clicks? A lot of times it's saying more outrageous things, more extremist things. And I think that's one of the things that you kind of see in terms of how some of these operations have worked and expanded and changed on social media.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you think then that the Hollywood role in American politics historically and the changing media landscape has kind of this set the stage for a president like Donald Trump to kind of rise to power then quite a bit, and then also I guess thinking like to what extent has Trump during his presidency tried to kind of mimic Richard Nixon a little bit in some ways?
Oh, it's really fascinating watching. Again, I was writing this book on cable television. I started writing it I started thinking about it in 2014, and kind of started digging into the Nixon presidency during the Trump presidency. So the parallels are very, very striking. I think one of like definitely Trump took a lot of lessons from the Nixon playbook, especially in terms of, denigrating the media, alleging bias, just kind of waging, really seeing the media as an enemy to be conquered. That is something that is very reminiscent of Richard Nixon. I think so I think there are some really striking parallels, especially when you kind of think of that media narrative. One of the things, however, that is different is that Nixon did not have something like Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Did not have this way that he could constantly fight back, right? So he had to be more strategic and kind of work these other levers to kind of wage this war. He couldn't wage it openly and directly. He also did not have the conservative media apparatus that was starting to form in the 1960s and 1970s, but was not this massive apparatus that really bolstered Trump's candidacy and his presidency. So those are some of the two really important factors that are very different.
Yeah. I guess we've gone from an actor president, with Ronald Reagan to someone who had their own reality TV show with Donald Trump. Is there a future then where we're going to have like some social media influencer or something as a president? Is that the next stage of this evolution or?
I do not know. I've learned long ago as a historian not to predict the future.
Yeah, I just
I was asked a lot of times in 2015 and 2016, with my book on the celebrity presidency, like, oh, did you predict Donald Trump? And I said, no, no, no one could have predicted the 2016 election.
yeah, I mean yes, that's true. It's very hard to figure out where society kind of goes from these different presidencies, which can be quite a bit different from each other.
Mhm.
I guess Biden is kind of a more traditional political figure compared to Trump. But yeah, definitely seems like the possibilities with a continuously evolving society presents new opportunities for people that maybe traditionally never would have been a political figure
Mhm.
in the first place. Because I mean, you have people who have these gigantic audiences, bigger than most politicians. I guess just as a matter of whether that democratizes kind of the political process more, where a person who has no political party connection can rise to power or not.
Mhm. Well, I think it shows the challenge of thinking through campaigns and how to get elected, how to get people's attention and support during an election year. But then, how do you govern? And I think what can help someone win an election may not be the things to help them govern. And I think that's what you see as a fundamental challenge for American government today is that the tools, the tactics, the rhetoric that gets people in the limelight, that helps them raise money, that maybe helps them win a primary. That actually, and then perhaps a general election in these gerrymandered districts. That isn't necessarily the skill sets and the tools needed to actually do something in terms of pass legislation and think through some of these critical issues.
Yeah. So when we're thinking of the history of the American presidency, what are the things then that stick out to you as someone studying presidential history that can be kind of things that we always need to keep an eye on as a society that's that continues to go on over time? Like, what are the things that presidents have done that maybe concerns you about like the future of the American political system and whether it can maintain itself as a democracy in the first place?
That's a great question. And I think that, you know, it's as a historian, it's really hard for me to say that certain things are unprecedented, but
Yeah.
there have been certain things in the last years that have been unprecedented. The January 6th insurrection, like this is something that is a direct attack on the democratic process, the integrity of the core of the democratic process, the peaceful transfer of power and people, and people voting and respecting the ballot box, right? And so that is something that is deeply concerning, and not writing that off as just, another incident, another crisis. That is something to pay close attention to. What happened, how to make sure that that challenge cannot triumph in the future. I think that's something to be very aware of. Uh, Donald Trump's, all of these, the lawsuits against him, the convictions, right? That we have not had a convicted felon run for president, and so as for a major party, I should say, and so I think that that is, understanding that yes, the presidency does evolve, but also understanding that there are laws and democratic norms that are really important, and democratic processes that are really important to fight for and to preserve and to not erode with, just kind of, to not allow any violations of those to be normalized.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's kind of one of the scary things about society today is that that kind of historical backdrop of knowledge that, a lot of historians will have when they're thinking about American history. I feel like for a lot of people, it doesn't exist. They don't know much. They assume that, maybe this isn't so strange, but it really is. Like
Mhm.
things that are happening today are just mind boggling, when compared to throughout American history. I mean, we haven't seen, I mean, it's truly historic times in many ways, which is weird because I don't know, it's not much fun necessarily to live in historical times when you're, a historian and you're thinking about things of the past, usually hoping that, oh, things are better. At least it's better than it was back then. Um, and in this case, in terms of sort of the rise of kind of throwing away democratic norms, it's I don't think there's much precedent for it that we're seeing, at
Mhm.
least in America. Obviously, around the world, you can look at that. But as our own country, we've always kind of uh, taken, I think, some of this stuff for granted, given what we're seeing
Mhm.
today.
Yeah, and I think, my colleagues who are Civil War historians and, historians of
Yeah.
Reconstruction, like that is the one moment where you do see similar, these tensions, the violence, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you know, that's also worrisome. That they're the ones that can kind of see the parallels very clearly. And that, was the Civil War and Reconstruction, right? So it's something to take seriously, especially the turn towards political violence. And as you mentioned, these attacks on democratic processes, that is something to take very, very, very seriously.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the as an entire situation, yeah, the Civil War would be the absolute worst case scenario for the country to fall into that again.
Yes,
Um,
and I'm not saying we're like on
yeah.
the brink of civil war,
No.
but I mean like these tensions, right? That
Right.
you kind of see here, these concerns, that the animosity, again, that embrace of violence, the willingness to kind of disregard election results. I always tell my students, and my opening lecture for my American presidency course is talking about the inauguration. And the inauguration, you can see many functions of the American presidency, as party leader, as head of state, and so we kind of
Yeah.
go through all of that, and then we talk about that. The only time there was not a peaceful transfer of power was when one side tried to deny the legitimacy of the presidency in 1860, and so I've had to revamp all some of that lecture in the wake of 2020 and in January 6th, and so I think, I mean, again, they're really serious issues, and it's a very different time, but it's important to, again, not normalize the dismissal of these attacks on democratic norms.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely an interesting kind of example of like how things could fall apart. If kind of continuing on this trail of demise, I guess, as a country and lack of trust amongst Americans. Um, yeah, luckily, at least at the moment, it seems like hopefully we're not on that trail. but but I feel like there'd probably be a lot of dominoes that would have to fall before starting to think about that. Also, I guess given just the geographical differences of the country and how it's set up today versus it was in the 1860s. But yeah, it's pretty disturbing, I guess, overall. I mean, we have, I mean, it's strange, I guess, in many ways that Trump has uh, really persisted about kind of detracting from what democracy typically does and kind of going up against that. Um, I guess in the Civil War, the situation is a little bit different in terms of country trying to break away versus just trying to change the rules to stay in power. Um, but very similar in terms of just, yes, this kind of uh, disbelief in the system and trusting the process and just wanting to do whatever they want. Kind of that type of
Mhm.
mentality seems to be resonating for the first time since the 1860s.
Yeah, and it's, the media environments are so different today, and that's one of the things that it's a different type of challenge than you had,
Yeah.
150 years ago. Is that, there's an ability to create through these different media environments and apparatuses, like there's an ability to create these different realities, and that there are many people who live in a reality that is not grounded in facts. It's not grounded in things that are actually happening or have happened. It's just grounded in misinformation and conspiracy theories. And so I think understanding the media environments and how that kind of contributes to some of the political divisions that exist, and allows someone like Trump to stay around. I think that that's a really important thing to understanding the challenges that we face today. And one of the things I always stress is, what are the solutions? And I mean, I always think that the more that we can expand media literacy, the more that we can teach people how to unpack sources and to think through what is factual, what is manipulated with, new technology, new media companies, all of these things. I think that is the really central to kind of combating some of the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, it seems like we have not been prepared as a society to educate people for the changing technology around them. I mean, and things are happening so fast when generation wise. I mean, the people that were, the kids protesting in the 60s and 70s, um, are now also there's a lot of them that are also the people that are like really big into kind of conspiracy theories. And it's just it's very strange to see that kind of generational shift where people are just the today is so different and people are not able to adjust with the times because technology is just drastically changing things at such a fast rate.
Mhm. Yeah, and it is changing things at a very fast rate. And I think your point about the importance of education to understand what is changing, how to navigate those changes, to kind of expand the toolbox that people have to navigate these changes. I think expanding that education is really central.
Yeah. Well, we'll hope for the best then. It should be interesting, at least from a historical standpoint, it'll be very interesting. Not necessarily a good thing that's interesting, but yeah, we'll see what happens. So what are you currently working on then in terms of research?
So I am starting a new book project that is it comes out of the project on cable television where, I found, very clear that, cable executives were aware about how profitable echo chambers could be, right? And that even though they may not really truly be informing people, they kept them from leaving the channel. And so the business of some of misinformation and polarization, to me, that's really interesting. And so I'm starting to look at a variety of different industries that emerged around in the 1980s and 1990s around, scandal and the control of information, all of that. So it's very new, but I'm really interested in some of these scandal industries that emerge in the 1990s.
Awesome. And what's the best way for people then to keep track of your work?
You can follow me. I'm still on Twitter or X as it's called. I'm not very active, but I am there. But at Kathryn Brownell, and also I keep my Purdue faculty webpage updated as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on and sharing all your knowledge about presidential history and the continuously interesting times we live in. So.
Thank you so much for the conversation.